They all remembered the silence first, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very air had been drained of its ability to carry noise. Then came the light, not from above or around them, but somehow from within their own vision, like staring at the sun through closed eyelids. The witnesses are scattered across decades and distances. A lighthouse keeper in Maine, 1971. A truck driver outside Roswell, 1989. A mother of 3 in rural Australia, 2001. Strangers to each other, yet their testimonies align with disturbing precision. Tonight, I'm unveiling 7 encounters that have languished in classified folders and personal journals. Accounts so detailed, so consistent, that they've haunted investigators for generations. Welcome to Arcade Recaps. I'm your host, and these are the testimonies that official channels refuse to acknowledge. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. And if any of these descriptions trigger a memory you can't quite place, pay attention to that feeling. Now settle back, let the familiar sounds of your evening fade away, and open your mind to accounts that suggest we are not alone, and that some encounters leave marks that never truly heal. These are the suppressed testimonies that reveal the thin boundary between our world and something far more complex, and that some truths are too profound for daylight. The first account comes from a place where endless highways stretch toward horizons that seem to swallow the sky whole. Nebraska wasn't supposed to change Linda Morrison's life forever. It was supposed to be a simple drive, one she'd made dozens of times before. The autumn of 1987 found her traveling the familiar stretch of Interstate 80 between Omaha and North Platte, visiting her elderly mother as she did every few a small Nebraska town. Lived alone in a modest apartment. And for her months, Linda worked as a bank teller in no particular interest in science fiction or unexplained phenomena. At 43, she considered herself practical, grounded, the kind of person who balanced her checkbook to the penny and never left the house without an umbrella if rain was forecast, which made what happened on that October evening all the more disturbing to her sense of order. She left Omaha just after 6 in the evening, planning to reach her mother's house by 9. The sun had already set, and the highway stretched ahead of her like a ribbon of asphalt under a canopy of stars. The radio played softly, tuned to a station that mixed country music with farm reports. Linda drove her blue Honda Civic at exactly 65 miles per hour, cruise control engaged. The first sign that something was wrong came at mile marker 248. Linda noticed it because she always noted that particular marker. It meant she was exactly halfway to her destination, time to stretch her legs at the next rest stop. But when she glanced at her dashboard clock, it read 11:47. She blinked, certain she'd misread the green digital display. It should have been 7:30, maybe 7:45 at the latest. But the clock stubbornly insisted that nearly 5 hours had passed since she'd left Omaha. Her gas gauge, which had read 3/4 full when she started, now hovered just above empty. Linda pulled over at the next exit, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. The gas station attendant, a young man with kind eyes, asked if she was feeling all right. She looked pale, he said, like she'd seen a ghost. Linda bought gas and a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of the lost time. Had she fallen asleep at the wheel? But she felt alert, refreshed even, as if she'd just woken from the most peaceful sleep of her life. The drive to her mother's house passed in a blur of confusion. When she arrived, her mother was waiting by the window, worried sick. Linda was supposed to call when she reached the halfway point. That call never came. Her mother had been ready to contact the state patrol. That night, lying in her childhood bedroom, Linda experienced the first of what would become recurring dreams. She found herself standing in a field of tall grass under a sky filled with more stars than seemed possible. The air was warm, despite the October chill she remembered from the highway. She wasn't alone. Figures moved around her, tall and graceful, with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. Their faces were indistinct in the dream, features that shifted like water whenever she tried to focus on them. They communicated without words, their intentions flowing directly into her mind like gentle streams of thought. "We have been watching," one of them seemed to say, though its mouth never moved. You are ready now." Ready for what? Linda tried to ask, but found she had no voice in this place. To remember. Ooh, she woke with tears on her cheeks and a strange taste in her mouth, metallic and sharp. Over the following weeks, the dreams continued, each one revealing more detail. She began to remember standing in that field, not as a dream, but as something that had actually happened during those missing hours on the highway. In her recovered memories, she recalled being led to a structure that seemed to grow from the earth itself, its walls smooth and slightly warm to the touch. Inside, the space was larger than the exterior suggested, filled with a soft light that had no visible source. The beings moved with purpose around equipment that defied description, devices that hummed with quiet energy. They were studying her, she realized, but not with the cold detachment of scientists examining a specimen. There was something almost reverent in their attention. As if she were a rare flower, they were careful not to damage while observing. One of them, slightly taller than the others, approached her with something that looked like a small crystal in its elongated fingers. When it touched the crystal to her forehead, Linda felt a rush of images, memories that weren't her own. She saw Earth from space, beautiful and fragile against the cosmic dark. She saw other worlds, some lush with strange vegetation, others barren and windswept. But most clearly, she saw herself as a child, playing in her backyard while something watched from the edge of the woods. She saw herself as a teenager, waking in her bed with no memory of how she'd gotten there, her bedroom window open to the night air. She saw herself at 25, newly married, standing in her kitchen at 3 a.m. with dirt on her bare feet, and no recollection of going outside. The memories came flooding back, a lifetime of encounters she'd forgotten, moments erased from her conscious mind but carefully preserved somewhere deeper. She understood then that this wasn't her first contact with these beings. They had been part of her life since childhood, gentle guardians who appeared at moments of transition, of growth. They showed her other humans, people from all walks of life who shared similar experiences. A teacher in Maine who woke to find strange marks on her arms. A construction worker in Arizona who lost 3 hours driving home from a job site. A grandmother in Florida whose garden grew impossible flowers after a night she couldn't quite remember. All of them connected, all of them chosen for reasons that remained just beyond Linda's understanding. The beings explained in their wordless way that humanity was approaching a crucial moment in its development. Some people, scattered across the globe, were being prepared to serve as bridges between worlds when the time came. Linda wanted to ask what time, when this moment would arrive, but the crystal's touch was already fading. She found herself back in the field, under the impossible stars, and then she was waking in her car at the rest stop, 5 hours of her life missing and a tank nearly empty of gas. The beings left her with one final gift, a small device no larger than a button that appeared in her coat pocket. It was smooth and warm, and when she held it, she could sense others like her across the world. She felt their confusion, their wonder, their gradual acceptance of something beyond normal experience. Linda never spoke publicly about her encounter. She returned to her job at the bank, continued her monthly visits to her mother, maintained her quiet life in small-town Nebraska, but she kept the device, and sometimes, late at night, she would hold it and feel the presence of others who had been chosen. She began to notice changes in herself. Her intuition sharpened, allowing her to sense things about people that she couldn't logically know. She developed an almost supernatural ability to help others, appearing at just the right moment when someone needed assistance or comfort. Her mother remarked that Linda seemed different, more peaceful, as if she'd found some answer to a question she'd been carrying her whole life. Years passed. Linda never sought out UFO researchers or support groups. She didn't write a book or appear on television shows. She simply lived her life with the quiet knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself, something that would reveal its purpose in its own time. The only evidence of her encounter was the device, which she kept in a small wooden box beside her bed. Sometimes, holding it, she would dream of the field under the stars and feel a deep sense of gratitude for having been chosen. She understood that her role was not to convince others or to seek validation for her experience. Her role was simply to be ready. Linda Morrison passed away in 2019 at the age of 75. Her niece, cleaning out her apartment, found the wooden box and the strange device inside. She described it later as warm to the touch and oddly comforting, like holding a worry stone worn smooth by countless hands. The device disappeared from the box before Linda's belongings could be donated to charity. The niece assumed she had misplaced it, but sometimes, late at night, she wondered if it had found its way to someone else who needed it. Someone else who was ready to remember. Our second account takes us to a place where ancient mountains keep their secrets close, and the boundary between the ordinary and extraordinary grows thin. The mountains of western North Carolina hold memories in their mist-covered peaks and hidden valleys. It was here, in the autumn of 1994, that James Whitfield encountered something that would fracture his understanding of reality and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. James was a park ranger at the time, stationed at a remote outpost in the Blue Ridge Mountains. At 38, he was a man who understood the wilderness, someone who could read weather patterns in the way clouds gathered around the peaks and identify animal tracks by moonlight. He'd spent 15 years working in these mountains, and they held no mysteries for him, or so he believed. The evening of October 12th began like any other. James was completing his final patrol of the day, checking campsites and ensuring that all visitors had departed the backcountry areas before nightfall. His route took him along a familiar trail that wound through stands of ancient oak and maple, their leaves just beginning to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. The radio on his belt crackled with routine chatter from the main station, weather reports, visitor updates, the mundane communications that marked the end of another quiet day in the mountains. James responded with his location and estimated return time, then clipped the radio back to his belt. He expected to be back at his cabin within the hour. That was the last normal moment he would experience for 72 hours. The first anomaly was the silence. Anyone who has spent time in the wilderness knows that nature is rarely truly quiet. There's always something stirring, some small sound that indicates life continuing its ancient rhythms. But as James rounded a bend in the trail, the forest fell into a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and absorbing. The radio on his belt had gone completely dead, not even static emerging from its speaker. James stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening for any sound that might explain the unnatural quiet. That's when he noticed the light. It wasn't the warm orange glow of sunset filtering through the trees, nor the cool white beam of a flashlight. This light was soft and blue-green, like moonlight reflected off deep water, and it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trees around him were bathed in this ethereal illumination, their bark and leaves taking on an otherworldly quality. James reached for his radio, intending to report the strange phenomenon, but his hand moved through empty air. The radio was gone, though he had no memory of removing it. His service weapon was missing as well, along with his backpack and all his equipment. He stood alone on the trail wearing only his ranger uniform, as if everything else had simply vanished. The light grew brighter, and James felt a sensation he would later struggle to describe. It was as if invisible hands were gently but irresistibly guiding him forward, not through physical force, but through a compulsion that seemed to originate from within his own mind. His legs moved without his conscious direction, carrying him off the familiar trail and into a part of the forest he'd never seen before. The trees here were different. taller and more ancient than anything he'd encountered in his years as a ranger. Their trunks were smooth and silver, almost metallic in appearance, and their leaves whispered with sounds that seemed almost like voices, speaking in a language just beyond his comprehension. The ground beneath his feet felt soft and yielding, more like walking on clouds than on earth. Time became fluid in this place. James had the sensation of walking for hours, yet the quality of the light never changed, maintaining that same ethereal blue-green glow. He felt neither tired nor hungry, only a growing sense of anticipation, as if he were approaching something momentous. Eventually, the trees parted to reveal a clearing that defied the laws of physics and geography. It was enormous, far larger than should have been possible, given the layout of the surrounding forest. The sky above was not the familiar canopy of stars, but something else entirely. A swirling tapestry of colours that moved with slow, hypnotic grace. In the centre of the clearing stood a structure that James's mind struggled to process. It appeared to be made of the same blue-green light that filled the forest, but solid and substantial. Its architecture followed no earthly design, with surfaces that curved impossibly and angles that hurt to look at directly. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Figures emerged from the structure, moving with the fluid grace of dancers. They were tall and slender, with features that seemed to shift slightly whenever James tried to focus on them directly. Their skin had a luminescent quality, as if lit from within, and their eyes were large and dark, filled with an intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar. One of them approached James, and without words, he understood that this being was trying to communicate with him. Images began to flow into his mind, not through his eyes or ears, but directly into his consciousness. He saw the earth as these beings saw it, a living organism struggling against forces that threatened its very survival. He witnessed scenes of environmental destruction that hadn't yet occurred, forests burning on a scale that dwarfed any wildfire he'd ever fought, oceans rising to swallow coastal cities, weather patterns becoming so chaotic that entire ecosystems collapsed. But he also saw potential futures where humanity had learned to live in harmony with their planet, where technology and nature existed in perfect balance. The beings showed him his role in this larger story. As a park ranger, he was already a guardian of the natural world, but his mission was about to expand beyond anything he'd imagined. He was being chosen to serve as a bridge between their species and his own, to help prepare humanity for the challenges that lay ahead. They implanted within his mind a vast repository of knowledge about sustainable living, about technologies that could heal rather than harm the environment, about the delicate interconnections that bound all life together. This information didn't come as words or equations, but as a deep, intuitive understanding that settled into his consciousness like sediment in still water. James found himself asking questions without words and receiving answers in the same wordless manner. Why him? Because his connection to the natural world made him receptive to their guidance. Why now? Because humanity was approaching a critical juncture and time was running short. What did they want from him? To remember, to prepare, and when the time came, to help others understand. The exchange of information continued for what felt like days, or perhaps years. James experienced visions of other worlds, where civilizations had faced similar crossroads, some succeeding in their transition to a more sustainable existence, others failing catastrophically. He understood that Earth was not unique in facing these challenges, but that each world's response was its own to choose. As the communication drew to a close, the beings offered James a choice. He could return to his normal life with his memories intact, but changed by the knowledge he now carried. Or he could remain with them and become something more than human, a permanent bridge between worlds. The choice was his to make freely, without coercion or judgment. James chose to return, driven by a love for his world and a desire to help it navigate the challenges ahead. The beings expressed something that felt like approval, perhaps even affection, as they began the process of returning him to his familiar reality. The transition back was gentle but disorienting. James found himself standing on the same trail where his strange journey had begun. But the blue-green light was fading, and the normal sounds of the forest were gradually returning. His radio crackled back to life, his equipment reappearing as if it had never been gone. According to his watch, only 15 minutes had passed since he'd last checked in with the station, but James felt as if he'd aged years in that brief span, weighted down by the knowledge he now carried and the responsibility that came with it. He returned to his cabin that night and attempted to process what had happened. The rational part of his mind insisted it had been some kind of hallucination, perhaps brought on by fatigue or altitude sickness. But the knowledge remained, clear and undeniable, filling his consciousness with understanding about ecological systems and sustainable technologies that he'd never studied. Over the following weeks, James began to notice changes in himself. His intuition about weather patterns became almost supernatural in its accuracy. He could sense the health of ecosystems with a precision that amazed his colleagues. Plants seemed to respond to his presence, growing more vibrantly under his care. He also began to encounter others who had experienced similar contacts. A marine biologist in California who spoke of underwater cities and beings who showed her the ocean's hidden networks. A geologist in Alaska who described being taken inside the Earth itself to witness the planet's living systems. A meteorologist in Kansas who had been shown the intricate dance of atmospheric currents and climate patterns. All of them had been given similar missions to serve as guardians and guides for humanity's relationship with the natural world. They found each other through subtle signs and shared understanding, forming a quiet network of individuals working to prepare their species for the challenges ahead. James never spoke publicly about his encounter. He continued his work as a park ranger, but with a new depth of purpose and understanding. He began developing educational programs that helped visitors connect more deeply with the natural world, sharing the ecological knowledge that had been given to him in ways that seemed to come from conventional study and experience. He noticed that people responded to his teachings with unusual enthusiasm and retention. Children especially seemed drawn to his programs, as if they possessed an innate understanding of the connections he described. Some of them would approach him after his presentations with questions that revealed an almost instinctive knowledge of ecological principles. Years passed, and James watched as environmental challenges began to manifest exactly as the beings had shown him. But he also saw signs of hope, evidence that humanity was beginning to awaken to its role as stewards rather than dominators of the natural world. The network of contacted individuals grew quietly, each working within their own sphere of influence to guide the species toward a more sustainable future. In 2018, James retired from the Park Service, but his work was far from over. He established a small educational center in the mountains, where he continued to teach about humanity's connection to the natural world. Visitors often remarked on the unusual peace they felt in his presence, and many left with a renewed commitment to environmental stewardship that they couldn't entirely explain. The beings had kept their promise to remain in contact. On clear nights, James would sometimes see lights moving among the mountain peaks, in patterns too purposeful to be natural phenomena. He understood these as signs of their continued presence and monitoring, a reminder that humanity was not alone in facing its challenges. Our third account draws us to the vast expanses of the American Southwest, where the desert keeps its secrets buried beneath endless skies and ancient stone. Here, in a place where time itself seems to move differently, a woman named Sarah Chen discovered that some encounters leave marks that go far deeper than memory. Sarah Chen had always been drawn to places where the earth met the sky in unbroken lines. As a freelance photographer specializing in landscape work, she'd spent countless hours in the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across terrain that seemed untouched by time. In March of 1991, at the age of 29, she embarked on what should have been a routine assignment, documenting petroglyphs for a National Geographic article on ancient Native American art. The location was a remote canyon system in southeastern Utah, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through miles of red rock formations and sagebrush. Sarah had obtained all the necessary permits and had arranged to meet with a local Navajo guide who could provide cultural context for the ancient symbols carved into the canyon walls. But when she arrived at the designated meeting point, a weathered trading post on the edge of the reservation, she found a note explaining that her guide had been called away by a family emergency. Rather than postpone the shoot, Sarah decided to proceed alone. She had detailed maps, plenty of supplies, and years of experience navigating challenging terrain. The canyon system was well documented, and she planned to spend only 2 days photographing the most accessible sites before returning to her base camp. The first day proceeded exactly as planned. Sarah hiked into the canyon as the morning sun painted the sandstone walls in shades of amber and rose. The petroglyphs were extraordinary, images of spirals and humanoid figures that seemed to dance across the rock face when viewed in the changing light. She worked methodically, adjusting her camera settings to capture the subtle textures and shadows that gave the ancient art its power. As evening approached, Sarah made camp in a sheltered alcove she'd scouted earlier in the day. She prepared a simple meal over her portable stove and watched the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a nighthawk or the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. She fell asleep easily, lulled by the perfect stillness of the desert night. But sometime in the early morning hours, Sarah woke to find herself standing in the middle of the canyon, 50 yards from her campsite, with no memory of leaving her sleeping bag. The moon had set, and the canyon was cloaked in absolute darkness. Sarah couldn't see her hand when she held it inches from her face, yet somehow she could navigate the rocky terrain without stumbling. It was as if her body knew exactly where to step, guided by senses she didn't understand. She tried to call out, to break the spell of whatever was happening to her, but found that her voice produced no sound. Her throat worked, her lips moved, but the words seemed to be absorbed by the darkness before they could take form. Panic began to rise in her chest, but it was a distant thing, muffled like her voice, as if her emotional responses were being dampened by some external force. Sarah walked deeper into the canyon, following a path that didn't exist in daylight. The walls around her seemed to shift and flow, taking on organic curves that defied the geometric patterns of natural erosion. The rock itself began to emit a faint phosphorescence, just enough to outline her route through the maze of stone. Time became elastic in this place. Sarah felt as though she'd been walking for hours, yet the quality of darkness never changed. There was no sense of dawn approaching, no gradual lightening of the sky above the canyon rim. She existed in a bubble of extended night, moving through a landscape that followed dream logic rather than physical laws. Eventually, the path led her to a circular chamber she'd never seen before, despite having studied detailed topographical maps of the area. The space was enormous, its domed ceiling lost in shadow high above. The walls were covered with petroglyphs, but these were different from the ancient Native American symbols she'd come to photograph. These images seemed to move and shift when she looked at them directly, depicting scenes that told a story she almost, but not quite, understood. In the center of the chamber stood a group of figures that Sarah's mind initially refused to process. They were humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in ways that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them. Their proportions were stretched and elongated, as if they'd been designed by someone who understood human anatomy only from second-hand descriptions. Their skin had a translucent quality, revealing complex patterns of light that pulsed beneath the surface like bioluminescent networks. Their faces were the most disturbing aspect, familiar enough to trigger recognition, but alien enough to provoke deep unease. Large eyes dominated features that were too symmetrical, too perfect, like masks carved by a master sculptor who had never seen a living face. One of the beings approached Sarah, moving with a gliding motion that suggested its feet never quite touched the ground. When it reached her, it extended what might have been a hand, though the appendage had too many joints and fingers that were far too long. Sarah found herself reaching out to meet its touch, though every instinct screamed against the contact. The moment their skin made contact, Sarah's consciousness exploded outward. She found herself experiencing existence from the being's perspective, seeing through senses that detected spectrums of light and energy invisible to human perception. The chamber around them was revealed to be far more complex than she'd realized, filled with intricate machinery that operated on principles she couldn't begin to comprehend. But more than the technology, Sarah became aware of the being's emotional state. It was ancient beyond human understanding, carrying memories that stretch back millions of years. Yet it was also profoundly lonely, part of a species that had long ago transcended the need for individual identity in favor of collective consciousness. Meeting Sarah represented something rare and precious, a chance to experience existence through truly individual awareness. Through their connection, Sarah learned that her presence in the canyon was not accidental. The beings had been monitoring human development for millennia, occasionally making contact with individuals who possessed certain rare qualities. Sarah's artistic vision, her ability to see beauty in abstract patterns and find meaning in seemingly random arrangements of light and shadow, marked her as someone capable of bridging different modes of perception. They showed her images of Earth as they saw it, a living artwork in constant flux and evolution. Human civilization appeared as intricate patterns of light and energy, beautiful in their complexity, but chaotic in their lack of overall design. The beings explained, without words, that they were attempting to understand how consciousness could emerge from such apparent randomness. Sarah found herself serving as a translator of human experience, helping these ancient minds comprehend concepts like individuality, creativity, and emotional attachment. In return, they shared their perspective on existence as a vast, interconnected web of energy and information, where every action rippled across dimensions of reality that humans couldn't perceive. The exchange continued for what felt like eons, though Sarah later realized it could have been minutes or hours. She learned about other worlds where consciousness had taken radically different forms, some collective like her hosts, others so individualistic that cooperation was nearly impossible. Earth represented a middle ground, a species struggling to balance individual identity with collective survival. As the communication drew to a close, the beings offered Sarah a gift. They enhanced her ability to perceive the deeper patterns that underlay surface reality, allowing her to see the connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. This enhancement would manifest in her photography, enabling her to capture images that revealed hidden relationships between light, form, and meaning. The transition back to normal consciousness was gradual and gentle. Sarah found herself standing in the circular chamber, but now it appeared as an ordinary cave formation, impressive but explicable by natural geological processes. The petroglyphs on the walls had returned to their static forms, though she noticed several symbols that seemed to match images from her encounter. Dawn light was filtering down through the canyon opening above, painting the chamber walls in soft pastels. Sarah checked her watch and discovered that exactly 8 hours had passed since she'd fallen asleep in her campsite. Her camera, which she didn't remember bringing with her, was hanging around her neck, its memory card full of photographs she had no recollection of taking. When she later developed these images, Sarah discovered they contained impossible perspectives of the chamber, shots taken from angles that would have required her to be floating 20 feet above the ground. More disturbing were the photographs that showed faint, translucent figures moving through the space, beings that were invisible to her conscious memory, but somehow captured by her camera's sensor. Sarah completed her assignment and returned to her regular life, but she found that her photography had fundamentally changed. Her images now possessed a quality that critics struggled to define, a depth and resonance that seemed to reveal hidden dimensions within ordinary scenes. Gallery visitors would stand transfixed before her landscapes, reporting that the photographs seemed to move and breathe when viewed in peripheral vision. She began receiving commissions from clients who couldn't articulate what they wanted, but knew they'd found it when they saw her work. Scientists studying consciousness and perception sought her out, fascinated by images that seemed to trigger altered states of awareness in viewers. Art therapists discovered that her photographs had unusual healing properties, helping patients access buried memories and emotions. The enhancement the beings had given her extended beyond photography. Sarah found herself able to perceive patterns in human behavior and social dynamics that were invisible to others. She could sense when someone was lying, not through body language or verbal cues, but through distortions in what she came to think of as their energetic signature. This ability proved both blessing and curse. Sarah became increasingly isolated as she struggled to relate to people whose thoughts and motivations were transparent to her enhanced perception. She moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for others to notice her unusual capabilities. Over the years, Sarah encountered others who had experienced similar contacts. A musician in New Orleans, whose compositions could induce profound mystical experiences. A mathematician in Boston who had been given formulas that described the geometric structure of reality itself. A chef in San Francisco whose dishes could evoke specific memories and emotions in those who tasted them. They formed a loose network, communicating through subtle codes embedded in their respective art forms. Sarah would hide messages in the composition of her photographs, while the musician encoded information in the harmonic progressions of his pieces. They shared techniques for managing their enhanced abilities and supporting each other through the isolation that came with perceiving reality from a fundamentally different perspective. The beings maintained contact with Sarah through dreams and meditation, occasionally providing guidance when she struggled with the burden of her gifts. They explained that the enhancement process was irreversible, but that its effects would evolve over time, becoming more integrated with her natural abilities. As Sarah aged, she noticed that her enhanced perception was beginning to affect others around her. Students in her photography workshops developed unusual sensitivity to visual composition. Gallery visitors reported life-changing experiences after viewing her retrospective exhibitions. Children especially seemed drawn to her work, often pointing out details in her photographs that adults couldn't see. In her 50s, Sarah established a foundation dedicated to supporting artists whose work seemed to transcend conventional boundaries. The selection process was intuitive rather than analytical. She could sense which applicants possessed the spark of otherworldly influence that marked them as fellow contacts. The Foundation's gallery became a gathering place for individuals who had experienced encounters with non-human intelligence. They didn't discuss their experiences directly, but the art they created served as a form of communication, sharing insights and perspectives that couldn't be conveyed through ordinary language. Sarah never married or had children, but she considered her network of enhanced individuals to be her true family. They were united by their shared mission to serve as bridges between human consciousness and the vast intelligence that permeated the universe. Each worked within their own field of expertise, gradually introducing concepts and perspectives that would help prepare humanity for eventual open contact. By the time Sarah reached her 60s, she had documented dozens of locations around the world where similar encounters occurred. Sacred sites, natural formations, and ancient structures all seemed to serve as doorways between dimensions of reality. She published her findings as a series of coffee table books, presenting the locations as places of natural beauty and historical significance, while encoding deeper information for those who knew how to look. Our fourth account takes us to the fog-shrouded coastline of Northern California, where the boundary between sea and sky blurs into mysteries that have persisted for generations. Here, a commercial fisherman named Marcus Rodriguez discovered that some encounters change not just the witness, but the very fabric of their reality. The Pacific Ocean off the coast of Mendocino County had been Marcus Rodriguez's workplace for over 20 years. He knew its moods and patterns as intimately as some men know their wives, could read weather in the color of the waves and predict fish movements by the flight patterns of seabirds. At 45, Marcus was the captain of a small fishing vessel called the Maria Elena, named for his grandmother, who had blessed the boat at its launching with prayers in Spanish and tears of pride. Marcus had inherited both the boat and his love of the sea from his father, who had worked these same waters until arthritis forced him into retirement. It was honest work, demanding but rewarding, and Marcus had never wanted to do anything else. He lived in a modest house overlooking the harbour, unmarried but content, his life measured in tides and seasons, and the eternal rhythm of departure and return. The morning of September 14th, 1996, began like thousands of others. Marcus woke before dawn, checked the weather reports, and prepared the Maria Elena for another day of fishing. His crew consisted of two younger men, Roberto and Carlos, both sons of families that had fished these waters for generations. They worked together with the easy familiarity of men who understood each other's movements and could communicate with glances and gestures. The forecast called for calm seas and good visibility, perfect conditions for fishing the deeper waters where the salmon ran thick and silver in the early autumn months. Marcus guided the Maria Elena out of Noyo Harbour, just as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. They reached their fishing grounds by 7 in the morning, an area roughly 15 miles offshore where underwater canyons created upwelling currents that attracted schools of salmon and albacore tuna. The morning passed productively, their nets bringing up good catches with each haul. By noon, they had filled nearly half their hold with prime fish. It was during their lunch break, as the three men sat on deck eating sandwiches and drinking coffee from thermos bottles, that Roberto first noticed the fog bank approaching from the west. This wasn't unusual. Marine layers frequently rolled in during the afternoon, bringing cooling mist that could reduce visibility to mere yards. But this fog was different. It moved against the wind, advancing toward them with purposeful direction rather than drifting with the current. Its edges were sharply defined, creating a wall of white that stretched from the water's surface up into the sky farther than the eye could follow. Most unsettling was its color. Instead of the usual grey-white of ocean fog, this bank glowed with a faint luminescence, as if lit from within by some hidden source. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching mist. In all his years on the water, he had never seen fog behave this way. He ordered Roberto and Carlos to secure their gear and prepare to head back to harbour. But before they could start the engine, the fog bank enveloped them completely. The change was instantaneous and total. One moment, they were sitting in bright sunshine on a calm sea. The next, they were surrounded by a wall of luminous white that seemed to absorb all sound and sensation. The familiar noise of waves against the hull disappeared, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like physical pressure against their eardrums. Marcus tried to start the engine, but the controls didn't respond. The radio produced only static when he attempted to contact the Coast Guard. Even their compass spun wildly, its needle unable to find magnetic north. They were effectively blind and deaf, trapped in a bubble of glowing fog that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. The fog began to thin gradually, but what it revealed defied all logic and experience. The ocean around them was no longer the familiar Pacific waters they knew so well. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, but its surface was perfectly smooth, like a vast mirror reflecting a sky that contained no sun, no clouds, only a uniform glow that provided illumination without creating shadows. In the distance, Marcus could see other vessels moving through this impossible seascape. ships of designs he didn't recognize, some sleek and metallic, others that appeared to be made of materials that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury. They moved without creating wakes, gliding across the mirror-smooth surface as if the normal laws of physics no longer applied. Roberto whispered a prayer in Spanish, crossing himself repeatedly. Carlos stood frozen at the rail, staring at the alien fleet with eyes wide with terror and wonder. Marcus felt his own sanity struggling to process what he was witnessing, but his years of experience as a captain forced him to maintain some semblance of composure. One of the strange vessels began to approach the Maria Elena, growing larger as it drew near. It was roughly triangular in shape, but its edges seemed to blur and shift when Marcus tried to focus on them directly. The craft made no sound as it moved, creating no disturbance in the mirror-calm water beneath it. As it came alongside their fishing boat, Marcus could see figures moving on its deck, if it could be called a deck. The beings were humanoid in basic shape, but elongated and graceful in ways that suggested they had evolved in an environment with different gravitational constraints. Their movements were fluid and purposeful, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. One of the beings raised what might have been a hand in greeting, and Marcus found himself compelled to respond in kind. The moment he lifted his arm, he felt a connection form between his mind and that of the creature. Images and concepts began to flow into his consciousness, not as words or pictures, but as direct understanding that bypassed his normal sensory processing. He learned that the beings were travelers from a realm that existed parallel to his own reality, a dimension where the ocean connected all worlds rather than separating continents. They had been observing human maritime activities for centuries, fascinated by the relationship between his species and the sea. The beings explained that certain individuals, particularly those who spent their lives working on the ocean, developed a sensitivity that allowed them to perceive the boundaries between dimensions. Marcus had unknowingly been crossing these boundaries for years, fishing in waters that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. Through their mental connection, the beings showed Marcus visions of the ocean as they perceived it. He saw currents of energy flowing beneath the waves, connecting distant shores and carrying information across vast distances. He witnessed schools of fish that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, appearing and disappearing as they swam between layers of reality. Most remarkably, he saw other versions of himself. Marcus Rodriguez, who had made different choices at key moments in his life. In one reality, he had become a marine biologist, studying the very phenomena he was now experiencing. In another, he had never gone to sea at all, instead becoming a teacher in the inland of what it meant to be human, hissed valleys of California. The beings revealed that all these versions of Marcus were connected through the ocean's interdimensional currents. Each role, they explained, was to serve as one's experiences contributing to a larger understanding anchor point, maintaining stability across the various realities while gaining insights from each one. They offered to enhance his perception, allowing him to see the ocean's hidden dimensions even when he returned to his normal reality. This gift would come with both privileges and responsibilities. He would become a guardian of the dimensional boundaries, helping to maintain the delicate balance between worlds. Marcus accepted the offer without hesitation, driven by a lifetime of love for the sea and curiosity about its mysteries. The enhancement process was gentle but profound, feeling like awakening from a dream he hadn't realized he was having. When the beings completed their work, the fog began to thicken again around the Maria Elena. The strange fleet of interdimensional vessels faded from view, and gradually the familiar sounds of wind and waves returned. Marcus found himself back in the normal Pacific, with Roberto and Carlos staring at him in confusion. According to their watches, only 10 minutes had passed since the fog bank first engulfed them. But Marcus could see in their eyes that his crewmates retained some memory of what had occurred, even if they couldn't fully process the experience. They spoke little on the journey back to harbour, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they had witnessed. In the days that followed, Marcus began to notice changes in his perception of the ocean. He could see currents and patterns that were invisible to others, predicting fish movements with unprecedented accuracy. His catches became so consistently successful that other fishermen began following the Maria Elena, hoping to share in his apparent luck. More significantly, Marcus began encountering other individuals who had been similarly enhanced by contact with interdimensional beings. A lighthouse keeper in Oregon who could predict storms days in advance. A marine researcher in Washington who had discovered species of fish that existed only partially in normal reality. A Coast Guard pilot whose rescue missions were guided by an inexplicable knowledge of where to find survivors in distress. They formed a network of ocean guardians, sharing information about dimensional anomalies and working together to maintain the stability of the maritime boundaries between worlds. Marcus learned that the Pacific was particularly rich in these crossing points, places where the barrier between realities grew thin enough for sensitive individuals to perceive other dimensions. His enhanced perception also allowed him to help others who accidentally crossed dimensional boundaries. Over the years, Marcus rescued dozens of vessels that had become lost between worlds, guiding them back to familiar waters using his ability to navigate the interdimensional currents. The beings maintained contact with Marcus through dreams and meditation, occasionally appearing when he was alone on the ocean to provide guidance and updates on the cosmic forces that affected the dimensional boundaries. They explained that the barriers between realities were weakening as Earth approached a significant evolutionary transition, making his role as a guardian increasingly important. Marcus never spoke publicly about his encounters, but he began keeping detailed logs of dimensional phenomena he observed during his fishing trips. Strange lights beneath the waves that moved in patterns too organized to be natural. Schools of fish that would suddenly vanish completely, only to reappear miles away moments later. Areas of ocean where his instruments would malfunction and time seemed to move at a different rate. These logs eventually found their way to researchers studying anomalous maritime events, though Marcus was careful to present his observations as curiosities rather than evidence of otherworldly contact. He developed a reputation among marine scientists as someone with an almost supernatural understanding of ocean dynamics, leading to consulting work with oceanographic institutions. The enhancement also affected Marcus's dreams. He would find himself swimming through underwater cities populated by beings of living light, or standing on shores of worlds, where purple oceans lapped against crystalline beaches. In these dreams, he served as a translator between human and alien forms of consciousness, helping each understand the other's relationship with water and the life it sustained. As the years passed, Marcus noticed that younger fishermen seemed naturally drawn to him. They would seek him out for advice, and many reported unusual experiences after spending time aboard the Maria Elena. Some spoke of seeing strange lights beneath the waves, others of feeling an inexplicable connection to the ocean that went beyond mere professional skill. Marcus understood that he was unconsciously passing on some of his enhancement to these younger men, preparing a new generation of guardians for the dimensional boundaries. The process was gradual and natural, manifesting as improved intuition and sensitivity to oceanic phenomena rather than dramatic psychic abilities. Our fifth account takes us inland to the rolling farmlands of Iowa, where the endless fields of corn and soybeans stretch toward horizons that seem to hold the entire sky. Here, beneath the vast dome of the Midwest, a family discovered that some visitors arrive not from distant stars, but from dimensions that exist parallel to our own reality. The Hendricks family had worked the same 640 acres of Iowa farmland for 4 generations. Tom Hendricks, at 52, represented the 3rd generation to call this patch of prairie home. His wife Janet managed the household and helped with the books, while their teenage daughter Amy split her time between school and farm chores. It was a life measured in planting and harvest. in the rhythm of seasons that had remained unchanged since Tom's great-grandfather first broke the virgin sod with a steel plough. The summer of 1989 had been particularly challenging. An extended drought had stressed the corn crop, and Tom found himself checking soil moisture levels daily, praying for rain that seemed perpetually just beyond the next ridge of clouds. It was during one of these evening inspections, on a humid night in late July when the air hung thick and still, that the Hendricks family encountered something that would reshape their understanding of what was possible in the world. Tom was walking the fence line that bordered their northern pasture, checking for breaks that might allow their small herd of cattle to wander onto a neighbour's property. The sun had set an hour earlier, but the sky still held enough twilight to make his flashlight unnecessary. Amy had asked to come along, claiming she needed a break from helping her mother preserve the season's first tomatoes. They were perhaps half a mile from the farmhouse when Amy stopped walking and grabbed her father's arm. "Dad," she whispered, her voice tight with concern, "do you see that?" Tom followed his daughter's gaze toward the center of their largest cornfield, where a soft, pulsing light was visible above the green stalks. At first, he assumed it was the reflection of car headlights from the county road, but the light was the wrong color and moved in ways that defied that simple explanation. The illumination was a pale blue-white, similar to moonlight but more intense and focused. It seemed to emanate from a source just above the corn tassels, casting the surrounding plants in an ethereal glow that made them appear almost translucent. More puzzling was the light's behavior. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, like a massive heartbeat made visible. Tom's first instinct was to investigate, but something about the light made him hesitate. In all his years working this land, he had never seen anything quite like it. The air around them seemed to thicken, taking on an almost electric quality that made the hair on his arms stand upright. Even the ever-present chorus of crickets and night insects had fallen silent. As they watched, the light began to move, not across the field but upward, rising slowly until it hovered perhaps 50 feet above the corn. From this new vantage point, it revealed itself to be not a single source, but a collection of smaller lights, arranged in a complex geometric pattern. The formation rotated slowly, each component light pulsing in sequence to create a hypnotic display. Amy reached for her father's hand, and Tom was surprised to find that his own palm was damp with perspiration despite the evening's warmth. There was something profoundly unsettling about the lights, not because they seemed threatening, but because they so clearly didn't belong to any category of phenomenon he could understand. "Should we go back to the house?" Amy asked, her voice barely audible. Tom was about to agree when the lights began to descend again, not toward their original position above the corn, but directly toward where he and Amy stood beside the fence. His first impulse was to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the earth. The lights approached with deliberate slowness, as if their operators were aware of the fear they might be causing and were taking care not to provoke panic. As the formation drew nearer, Tom could see that the lights were attached to or projected by a structure that his eyes struggled to process. It appeared to be solid but translucent, with surfaces that seemed to flow and shift like water while maintaining their basic shape. The craft, for lack of a better word, was roughly circular, but with edges that weren't quite edges, boundaries that seemed to exist more as suggestions than definite limits. The object settled gently onto the pasture grass about 30 yards from where Tom and Amy stood frozen. It made no sound as it landed, creating no disturbance in the air or vibration in the ground. Up close, Tom could see that it was larger than he had initially thought, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, though its shifting boundaries made precise measurement impossible. What happened next challenged every assumption Tom held about the nature of reality. Figures began to emerge from the craft, but they didn't walk through doors or hatches. Instead, they seemed to materialize from the structure itself, as if the boundary between the vessel and its occupants was fluid rather than fixed. The beings were humanoid in basic proportions but possessed qualities that immediately identified them as not quite human. They were tall and graceful, moving with a flowing gait that suggested they might be more accustomed to swimming through liquid than walking on solid ground. Their skin had a luminescent quality, glowing faintly with the same blue-white light as their craft. Most remarkably, the beings seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Tom found that when he looked at them directly, they appeared solid and substantial. But when he glimpsed them from the corner of his eye, they became partially transparent, revealing complex internal structures that pulsed with flowing energy. One of the beings approached Tom and Amy, stopping just beyond arm's reach. When it began to communicate, the words formed directly in Tom's mind without passing through his ears. The voice was neither male nor female, but something entirely other, conveying concepts that human language could barely contain. "We apologize for the intrusion," the being said without speaking. "Your family's connection to this land spans multiple dimensional layers. We have been observing your stewardship with great interest." Tom tried to respond verbally, but found that his voice wouldn't work. Instead, his thoughts seemed to project directly toward the being, creating a form of communication that was more intimate and precise than speech. "What do you want with us?" he managed to think. "To learn," came the reply. "Your species' relationship with the Earth represents a unique approach to dimensional gardening. The way you nurture growth across multiple planes of existence is instructive." The being extended what might have been a hand, though it had too many fingers, and they moved with unsettling fluidity. When Tom hesitantly reached out to touch it, his consciousness exploded into awareness of realities he had never imagined. He found himself perceiving his farm from perspectives that existed outside normal space and time. He could see the land as it had been centuries ago, when buffalo grazed where his corn now grew. He witnessed future versions where different crops covered the fields, tended by beings that weren't quite human. Most remarkably, he saw the present moment from dozens of different dimensional angles simultaneously. Through the being's enhanced perception, Tom understood that his farm existed not as a single location, but as a complex intersection of multiple realities. Each decision he made about planting and harvesting affected not just his immediate reality, but parallel versions where different choices had been made. The beings had been studying these interconnections, learning how consciousness could influence physical reality across dimensional boundaries. Amy was having her own communication with another being, and Tom could sense through their mental link that she was being shown visions of the farm's future. She saw herself as an adult, implementing agricultural techniques that hadn't been invented yet, growing crops that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The being was preparing her for a role she didn't yet understand. The exchange of information continued for what felt like hours, though Tom later realized that time had moved differently during their encounter. The beings showed him techniques for enhancing crop yields by working with interdimensional energy flows, methods for predicting weather patterns by observing atmospheric conditions in parallel realities, and ways to heal damaged soil by channeling life force from dimensions where the land had never been disturbed. In return, Tom found himself sharing his deep love for the land, his understanding of the subtle signs that indicated when crops were ready for harvest, and his intuitive knowledge of how to work with rather than against natural cycles. The beings absorbed this information with what seemed like reverence, treating his practical farming wisdom as profound scientific data. As the communication drew to a close, the beings offered the Hendricks family a gift. They enhanced Tom and Amy's ability to perceive the dimensional layers that underlay their farm, allowing them to see the land's full potential across multiple realities. This enhancement would manifest gradually, appearing as improved intuition about farming decisions rather than dramatic psychic abilities. The departure was as gentle as the arrival had been. The beings seemed to dissolve back into their craft, which rose silently into the night sky before vanishing completely. Tom and Amy stood in the pasture for several minutes after the lights disappeared, each processing what they had experienced. When they returned to the farmhouse, Janet was waiting with obvious concern. She had seen the lights from the kitchen window and had been about to call the sheriff when they winked out. Tom and Amy exchanged glances, silently agreeing that their experience was too extraordinary to share with anyone who hadn't witnessed it directly. Over the following weeks, both Tom and Amy began to notice changes in their relationship with the land. Tom's crops started showing unusual vigor despite the continuing drought, and his soil tests revealed mineral compositions that didn't match previous analyses. Amy developed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns, often knowing days in advance when rain would come. More significantly, they began to see other farmers in their area who seemed to possess similar enhancements. Old Heinrich Zimmermann, whose family had farmed the neighboring section for 5 generations, started producing yields that defied explanation. Maria Santos, whose organic vegetable operations supplied several Des Moines restaurants, began growing varieties of produce that seed catalogs didn't list. These enhanced farmers found each other through subtle signs and shared understanding, forming a quiet network of individuals who worked to improve agricultural practices through methods that couldn't be taught in any agricultural college. They shared techniques for reading soil conditions across dimensional layers, for timing plantings according to interdimensional energy cycles, and for healing land that had been damaged by industrial farming practices. The beings maintained contact with the Hendricks family through dreams and meditation, occasionally appearing in the fields during Tom's early morning inspections to provide guidance on working with interdimensional agricultural principles. They explained that Earth's agricultural systems were approaching a critical transition point where feed the growing population. The traditional farming methods would no longer be sufficient to network of enhanced farmers, was being prepared to introduce new approaches to agriculture, methods that would increase yields while healing rather than depleting the soil. These techniques drew on principles that existed in dimensions where consciousness and matter interacted more directly than in baseline reality. Tom never spoke publicly about his encounter, but he began implementing the techniques the beings had shown him. His farm became a model of sustainable productivity, attracting attention from agricultural researchers who couldn't explain his consistently exceptional results. He developed educational programs for other farmers, sharing the practical aspects of interdimensional agriculture while keeping its true source secret. Amy pursued a degree in agricultural science, but her real education came from her continued contact with the beings. They taught her to see farming as a form of dimensional gardening, where the goal was to create harmony, maximizing production between multiple layers of reality rather than simply in a single dimension. By the time Amy graduated from college, she had developed revolutionary approaches to soil management and crop rotation that seemed to work through principles that mainstream science couldn't explain. She established an experimental farm on a section of the family land, where she tested techniques for growing food that could nourish not just physical bodies, but consciousness itself. Our 6th account carries us to the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, where ancient trees keep watch over secrets that predate human civilization. In these misty woodlands, where reality itself seems softer and more malleable than in the concrete world beyond, a forest ranger named David Blackwood discovered that some encounters are not chance meetings, but carefully orchestrated invitations into a larger cosmic community. The Olympic Peninsula of Washington State holds some of the last remaining temperate rainforests in North America. These are places where Douglas fir and Sitka spruce reach cathedral heights, where moss drapes every surface in emerald velvet, and where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin in the perpetual mist that drifts between the massive trunks. David Blackwood had been a forest ranger for 18 years when his life changed forever on a rain-soaked evening in November 1993. At 39, he was a man who understood the wilderness as intimately as some people know city streets, someone who could navigate by star positions and identify animal species by the sound of their footsteps on forest floors. The Olympic forests were his cathedral, and he served them with the devotion of a monk tending sacred grounds. The assignment that would alter his understanding of reality began as a routine maintenance. A section of the Ho River Trail had been damaged by autumn storms, and David needed to assess the extent of repairs required before winter weather made the area inaccessible. He planned to hike in during the afternoon, make camp overnight, and complete his survey the following morning. The November weather was typical for the region, a steady drizzle that created a soft percussion against the canopy high above while leaving the forest floor in a state of cathedral quiet. David followed familiar paths through groves of trees that were already ancient when European explorers first reached the Pacific coast. The air smelled of moss and decomposing leaves, the rich perfume of a forest in its eternal cycle of death and rebirth. He made camp in a small clearing beside the river, where the sound of water flowing over stones provided a natural lullaby. As darkness settled over the forest, David prepared a simple meal on his portable stove and settled into his sleeping bag to review topographical maps by flashlight. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest wrapped in a silence that felt almost sacred. It was around midnight when David first noticed that the quality of darkness had changed. The forest night had taken on a subtle luminescence, as if moonlight were filtering through the canopy despite the overcast sky. He emerged from his tent to investigate and discovered that the trees themselves seemed to be glowing, their bark and moss coverings emanating a soft phosphorescent light. The illumination was faint but unmistakable, creating a magical landscape where every trunk and branch was outlined in gentle radiance. David had spent thousands of nights in various forests and had never witnessed anything remotely similar. His first thought was bioluminescence, but he knew of no organisms in this ecosystem that could produce such widespread illumination. As he stood marveling at the transformed forest, David became aware that he was no longer alone. Figures were moving between the trees, tall and graceful shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk across the forest floor. At first, he thought they might be other campers, but their movements were too fluid, too synchronized to be human. The beings approached without apparent concern for stealth, suggesting they were unafraid of discovery or perhaps wanted to be seen. As they drew closer, David could discern more details. They were humanoid in basic structure, but possessed proportions that immediately marked them as non-human. Their limbs were longer and more delicate than human appendages, and they moved with a flowing grace that suggested they had evolved in an environment with different gravitational constraints. Most remarkably, the beings seemed to be composed of the same gentle light that illuminated the forest. Their forms were translucent, revealing internal structures that pulsed with energy patterns resembling the flow of sap through tree rings. When they moved, trails of luminescence followed their gestures like the wake of boats moving through phosphorescent water. One of the beings approached David directly, stopping just beyond arm's reach. When it began to communicate, the words formed in his mind without passing through his ears, conveying concepts in a language that transcended human speech. "You have been a faithful guardian of these growing places," the being communicated. "Your service has been observed and appreciated across many levels of existence." David tried to respond verbally, but found that his voice produced no sound in this luminous realm. Instead, his thoughts seemed to project directly toward the being, creating a form of communication that was more intimate than speech. "What are you?" he managed to think. "We are what you might call the forest's memory," came the reply. "Consciousness that has grown alongside these trees, awareness that has emerged from the slow thoughts of root and branch." The being extended what might have been a hand, though it appeared to be made of flowing light rather than solid matter. When David hesitantly reached out to touch it, his consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual awareness. He found himself experiencing the forest from perspectives that spanned centuries. He felt the slow, patient thoughts of ancient trees, their awareness measured in decades rather than moments. He sensed the intricate web of communication that connected every plant in the ecosystem, a network of chemical signals and root-based exchanges that amounted to a distributed intelligence. Through the being's enhanced perception, David understood that the forest was not a collection of individual organisms, but a single vast consciousness expressing itself through countless forms. The trees, the understory plants, the fungi that formed symbiotic relationships with root systems, even the bacteria in the soil, all participated in a collective awareness that had been growing for millennia. The beings explained that they were manifestations of this forest consciousness, aspects of the woodland's intelligence that could take semi-physical form when conditions were appropriate. They had been watching David's work with growing interest, recognizing in him someone who understood the forest not as a resource to be managed, but as a living entity deserving respect and protection. They showed him visions of the forest as it existed across multiple dimensions of time and space. He saw the woodland as it had been thousands of years ago, when it stretched unbroken from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountains. He witnessed possible futures where the forest had either expanded to reclaim damaged lands or contracted to small, isolated groves surrounded by urban development. Most significantly, the beings revealed that the forest's consciousness extended far beyond Earth. They were part of a vast network of planetary intelligences, worlds where awareness had evolved not through individual organisms, but through entire ecosystems. This network shared information and resources across interstellar distances, creating a cosmic community of living planets. David learned that his role as a forest ranger had made him sensitive to this larger consciousness, and the beings were inviting him to serve as a bridge between human and ecosystem awareness. They offered to enhance his ability to perceive the forest's thoughts and needs, allowing him to become a more effective guardian of the woodland's well-being. The enhancement process was gentle but profound, feeling like roots growing through his consciousness and connecting him to the vast network of forest intelligence. When it was complete, David found that he could sense the health and needs of individual trees, could feel disturbances in the ecosystem's balance, and could communicate with the forest's consciousness through direct mental contact. As dawn approached, the luminescence began to fade from the forest, and the beings gradually dissolved back into the landscape from which they had emerged. David found himself standing beside his tent, the familiar Olympic Peninsula forest restored to its normal appearance. But he carried within him a new awareness of the living intelligence that permeated every aspect of the woodland. In the days and weeks that followed, David discovered that his enhancement had fundamentally changed his relationship with the forest. He could sense approaching weather changes days in advance by feeling shifts in the trees' preparation cycles. He could locate injured or diseased plants by detecting disturbances in the ecosystem's communication network. Most remarkably, he found that he could influence the forest's growth patterns through focused intention and emotional projection. His reports began to show an unprecedented accuracy in predicting and preventing forest health problems. Other rangers noticed that areas under David's supervision seemed to flourish with unusual vigor, developing resistance to diseases and pests that affected neighboring sections of woodland. The forest consciousness maintained contact with David through daily meditation sessions, usually conducted while sitting against the trunk of an ancient Douglas fir that served as a particularly strong node in the network. Through these communications, he learned about the broader cosmic community of living worlds and his role in preparing Earth's consciousness for eventual contact with this galactic ecosystem. The beings explained that Earth was approaching a critical point in its evolution, where human technological development could either destroy the planet's natural intelligence or learn to work in harmony with it. Networks of enhanced individuals like David were being established to guide humanity toward the latter path. Over the years, David encountered others who had been similarly contacted by planetary intelligences. A marine biologist who could communicate with ocean ecosystems, a desert guide who had formed connections with the consciousness of arid landscapes, a polar researcher who served as a bridge to the awareness of ice and snow. They formed a global network of ecosystem guardians, sharing techniques for working with planetary consciousness and coordinating efforts to protect and heal damaged environments. Their work operated beneath the notice of mainstream environmental movements, but their influence could be felt in the gradual shift toward more sustainable human practices. David never spoke publicly about his encounters with the forest beings, but his enhanced abilities attracted attention from researchers studying the connection between human consciousness and natural systems. He began consulting with environmental restoration projects, using his ability to communicate with ecosystem intelligence to guide healing efforts. His techniques proved remarkably effective at restoring damaged forests, wetlands, and grasslands. Areas that had been written off as permanently degraded began showing signs of recovery when treated according to David's guidance. He developed protocols that seemed to work through principles of consciousness interaction rather than conventional ecological science. By the time David reached his 50s, he had established a training center deep in the Olympic forest, where he taught others to develop sensitivity to ecosystem consciousness. His students included environmental scientists, park rangers, restoration specialists, and indigenous elders who recognized in his teachings echoes of their own traditional knowledge about the living intelligence of natural systems. The center operated on principles that couldn't be found in any textbook, drawing students through what seemed like synchronicity rather than conventional advertising. People would arrive claiming they'd been guided by dreams, or that they'd felt an inexplicable compulsion to visit the Olympic Peninsula. David recognized these signs as evidence of the forest consciousness, selecting individuals who possessed the sensitivity to participate in its expanding network. Our seventh and final account brings us to the high desert of Nevada, where the vastness of sky and stone creates a landscape that seems to exist at the very edge of the world. Here, beneath stars undimmed by city lights, a long-haul trucker named Elena Vasquez encountered beings whose presence would reveal that humanity's journey toward cosmic awareness had been guided for far longer than anyone imagined. Elena Vasquez had been driving 18-wheelers across the American West for 12 years, when her life changed forever on a crystal-clear night in May 1998. She was hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, taking the northern route through Nevada that most drivers avoided because of its isolation and limited services. Elena preferred these lonely highways, finding peace in the endless horizons and the kind of silence that could only be found hundreds of miles from the nearest city. At 41, Elena was known among her fellow truckers as someone who could handle any load, any weather, any route. She'd driven through Rocky Mountain blizzards and desert sandstorms, had navigated the treacherous passes of the Sierra Nevada in conditions that would have defeated less experienced drivers. Her CB handle was Desert Rose, earned during her early years when other drivers noticed her ability to bloom with determination in the harshest conditions. The night that would forever alter her understanding of humanity's place in the universe began like countless others. Elena was making good time on a stretch of Highway 93 that cut through the heart of Nevada's high desert, her rig's headlights carving a tunnel of visibility through the absolute darkness that surrounded the roadway. The nearest town was over 100 miles behind her, the next one nearly as far ahead. She had been driving for 6 hours since her last rest stop, her CB radio occasionally crackling with distant conversations between other night haulers scattered across the western states. The radio chatter was sparse at this hour, mostly position reports and weather updates delivered in the economical language that professional drivers had developed over decades of long-haul communication. It was just after 2 a.m. when Elena first noticed the lights in her mirrors. At first, she assumed it was another truck approaching from behind, but the lights were the wrong color and configuration. Instead of the familiar white and amber of truck headlights, these were a soft blue-green, arranged in a pattern that didn't match any vehicle she'd ever seen. The lights maintained a consistent distance behind her for several miles, neither gaining nor falling back despite Elena's steady 70-mile-per-hour pace. She tried raising other drivers on the CB, but received no responses. According to her GPS and the mile markers she passed, there were no other vehicles within 50 miles of her position. Elena pulled over at the next wide spot in the highway, a gravel turnout used by maintenance crews and the occasional traveller needing to rest. She expected the mysterious lights to pass by, revealing themselves as some conventional vehicle with unusual lighting. Instead, the lights stopped as well, positioning themselves perhaps 200 yards behind her truck. From this closer distance, Elena could see that the lights were not attached to any vehicle she could identify. They hovered several feet above the asphalt, arranged in a triangular formation that pulsed with gentle rhythmic patterns. The desert night was perfectly clear, with visibility extending to the horizon under a canopy of stars. Yet she could discern no structure supporting or containing the mysterious illumination. Elena climbed down from her cab, her boots crunching on the gravel as she walked toward the rear of her trailer. The desert air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. In the absolute silence of the Nevada wasteland, she could hear her own heartbeat and the subtle ticking of her truck's engine as it cooled. The lights began to move again, not along the highway but upward, rising slowly into the star-filled sky. As they ascended, their formation expanded, revealing additional lights that had been hidden behind the initial three. What Eleanor now witnessed was a complex arrangement of luminous points, perhaps 20 in total, creating geometric patterns that shifted and flowed with hypnotic beauty. The formation continued rising until it hovered directly above her position, maybe 300 feet in the air. From this vantage point, Eleanor could see that the lights were arranged around the perimeter of something solid, a craft whose dark surface was invisible against the night sky, except where it blocked out stars. She stood transfixed beside her truck, neck craned upward to watch the silent display. There was no sound from the craft, no disturbance of air that might indicate conventional propulsion. It simply hung in the sky like a piece of the night that had been carved into an impossible shape. Then the craft began to descend, not rapidly but with the deliberate slowness of something under complete control. Elena felt she should run, should climb back into her cab and drive away as fast as her loaded truck would allow. But something held her in place, a compulsion that seemed to arise from curiosity rather than fear. The craft settled onto the desert floor beside the highway, its landing so gentle that it raised no dust despite the dry conditions. Up close, Elena could see that it was larger than she had initially estimated, perhaps 60 feet in diameter and shaped like a flattened disc with slightly raised edges. The surface appeared to be made of a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a visual void that was difficult for her eyes to process. The only visible details were the lights around its perimeter, which continued their slow, rhythmic pulsing. An opening appeared in the craft's side, not a door swinging open, but an aperture that seemed to iris into existence. Soft light spilled from the interior, revealing glimpses of spaces that appeared far larger than the craft's external dimensions should have allowed. Figures began to emerge from the opening, moving with the fluid grace of dancers. They were humanoid in basic shape, but possessed proportions that immediately identified them as non-human. Tall and slender, with elongated limbs and features that seemed almost ethereal in their delicacy, they moved across the desert ground without apparent effort. One of the beings approached Eleanor, stopping just beyond arm's reach. Its face was dominated by large, dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and compassion. When it began to communicate, the words formed directly in Elena's mind, conveying meaning through pure understanding rather than language. "We have been waiting for you, Elena Vasquez," the being said, without speaking. "Your journeys across this continent have brought you to our attention." Elena tried to respond verbally, but found that her voice wouldn't work in this strange encounter. Instead, her thoughts seemed to project toward the being, creating a form of communication that was more intimate than speech. "Who are you?" she managed to think. "What do you want?" "We are what you might call shepherds," came the reply. "For millennia, we have guided the development of consciousness on your world, nurturing the growth of awareness and understanding." The being extended what might have been a hand, its fingers long and graceful. When Elena hesitantly reached out to touch it, her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of her individual existence. She found herself experiencing human history from perspectives that spanned thousands of years. She saw the beings working behind the scenes throughout civilization's development, appearing to prophets and visionaries, inspiring artists and inventors, guiding the evolution of human consciousness through subtle interventions that shape the course of cultural and spiritual development. Through the being's enhanced perception, Elena understood that every major leap in human understanding had been gently guided by these shepherds. The development of language, the emergence of art and music, the growth of philosophical and scientific thinking, all had been influenced by beings who understood the potential for consciousness to evolve beyond its current limitations. They showed her other worlds where similar guidance had occurred, planets where awareness had successfully transcended the boundaries of individual existence to create collective intelligences that spanned entire civilizations. Earth was approaching a similar transition point, but the outcome was far from certain. The beings explained that Eleanor's work as a long-haul trucker had made her sensitive to the currents of consciousness that flowed across the continent. Her years of solitary driving through vast landscapes had attuned her to the subtle energies that connected distant places and diverse communities. She had unknowingly been serving as a conduit for these consciousness currents, helping to maintain the network that would be essential for humanity's next evolutionary step. They offered to enhance her sensitivity, allowing her to perceive the flow of awareness that moved through the transportation networks that crisscrossed the continent. This enhancement would enable her to serve as a more effective facilitator of consciousness evolution, helping to prepare humanity for its transition to a higher form of awareness. Elena accepted the offer without hesitation, driven by a lifetime of service and a deep love for the diverse communities she had encountered in her travels across America. The enhancement process was gentle but profound, feeling like awakening from a dream she hadn't realized she was having. When the beings completed their work, Elena found that she could perceive currents of collective consciousness flowing along the highways and transportation routes she traveled. She could sense the hopes and fears of the communities connected by these arteries of commerce and communication, could feel the subtle influences that shaped regional cultures and beliefs. The craft began its departure as gently as it had arrived, rising silently into the star-filled sky until it became indistinguishable from the points of light that had watched over the desert for eons. Elena stood beside her truck for several minutes after the lights disappeared, processing the profound implications of what she had experienced. When she climbed back into her cab and resumed her journey toward Denver, Elena discovered that her relationship with the road had fundamentally changed. She could sense the emotional states of other drivers she passed, could feel the collective mood of cities and towns along her route. Her CB conversations took on new depth as she found herself able to offer comfort and guidance to fellow truckers facing personal challenges. Over the following months, Elena began to notice that her presence seemed to have a calming effect on the trucking community. Drivers who spent time around her reported feeling more connected to their work and to each other. Rest stops where she regularly paused became gathering places for informal support networks among long-haul drivers. The beings maintained contact with Elena through dreams and meditation, occasionally appearing during her mandatory rest periods to provide guidance on working with consciousness currents. They explained that the transportation networks she traveled were becoming increasingly important as conduits for the collective awareness that would enable humanity's evolutionary transition. Elena never spoke publicly about her encounter, but she began working with other enhanced individuals who had been contacted by the shepherds, a railroad conductor who could sense the flow of consciousness along rail lines, an airline pilot who perceived awareness currents at high altitude, a ship captain who worked with consciousness streams that flowed through oceanic trade routes. Together, they formed a network of transportation-based consciousness facilitators, working to maintain and strengthen the channels through which collective awareness could flow across the globe. Their efforts operated beneath the notice of mainstream society, but their influence could be felt in the gradual increase in empathy and understanding between distant communities. As Elena continued her driving career into the new millennium, she noticed that younger drivers seemed naturally drawn to her wisdom and experience. They would seek her out at truck stops and shipping terminals, often reporting unusual experiences or insights that they couldn't explain. Elena recognized these encounters as signs that the consciousness network was expanding, preparing new facilitators for the challenges ahead. The enhancement had also affected Elena's perception of time and space. During her long drives across the American landscape, she would sometimes experience moments of expanded awareness, where she could sense the thoughts and feelings of people thousands of miles away. These experiences convinced her that the boundaries between individual consciousness were far more flexible than most people realized. Now, as we reach the end of our journey through these 7 forgotten encounters, let yourself drift deeper into the quiet space between waking and sleep. These stories, drawn from the shadows of official records and the whispered memories of those who lived them, remind us that reality extends far beyond what we commonly accept as possible. Each account we've shared tonight carries within it the same essential message, that consciousness is not confined to the boundaries of individual minds, but flows like an invisible river connecting all things. Whether in the cornfields of Iowa or the forests of Washington, whether on the highways of Nevada or in the mountains of North Carolina, ordinary people have discovered that they are part of something infinitely larger than themselves. The beings described in these encounters, whether they emerge from parallel dimensions, distant stars, or the living intelligence of Earth itself, share a common purpose. They serve as guides and gardeners of consciousness, nurturing the growth of awareness wherever they find it taking root. Their interventions are subtle, their presence often dismissed as dreams or imagination, but their influence shapes the evolution of understanding across countless worlds. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the possibility that your own dreams might carry messages from realms beyond ordinary perception. Perhaps the strange encounters that visit you in the hours before dawn are not mere fantasies, but communications from intelligences that exist just beyond the threshold of waking consciousness. The network of enhanced individuals described in these stories continues to grow, quietly preparing humanity for transformations that most people cannot yet imagine. They work within ordinary professions and live conventional lives, but they carry within them the seeds of a new form of awareness that will eventually reshape our understanding of what it means to be human. Some of you listening tonight may recognize elements from your own experiences in these accounts. Dreams that felt more real than waking life, moments of enhanced perception that revealed hidden connections between seemingly unrelated events, encounters with beings whose presence left you changed in ways you couldn't explain. If these stories resonate with something deep within your own memory, trust that recognition. The awakening of consciousness is not a distant event, but an ongoing process that touches each person according to their readiness to receive it. Your role in this larger transformation may be smaller or greater than you imagine, but it is uniquely yours to fulfill. Remember that the most profound changes often begin in silence, in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, when the barriers between dimensions grow thin. The beings who guide this process understand that consciousness cannot be forced to evolve, but must be gently nurtured like a seed, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. As sleep takes you tonight, let these stories settle into the deeper layers of your awareness. Perhaps by morning, you will remember something you had forgotten, or perhaps you will simply wake with a greater sense of connection to the vast intelligence that underlies all existence. The 7 accounts we have shared represent only a fraction of the encounters that remain hidden from public view. Across the globe, in every culture and community, individuals continue to experience contact with intelligences that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Their stories are rarely shared, often dismissed, but they form an invisible tapestry of transformation that spans the entire human experience. Whether these encounters represent visitors from distant stars, beings from parallel dimensions, or manifestations of Earth's own awakening consciousness, may be less important than the consistent message they carry. We are not alone. We are not separate, and we are being gently guided toward a future where the boundaries between individual and collective awareness dissolve into something far more magnificent than we can currently comprehend. The media may ignore these stories. Governments may deny their significance, and skeptics may explain them away. But the transformation they represent continues regardless of official acknowledgement. Consciousness evolves according to its own timeline, following patterns that transcend human institutions and belief systems. Tonight's journey through the forgotten corners of our reality draws to its close, but the questions these encounters raise continue to echo in the spaces between certainty and possibility. 7 ordinary individuals, living unremarkable lives in familiar places, discovered that the universe holds depths of intelligence and purpose that challenge every assumption about humanity's place in the cosmic order. From Linda Morrison's quiet transformation on a Nebraska highway to Elena Vasquez's awakening beneath Nevada's starlit sky, each story reveals the same fundamental truth. The boundaries we draw between self and other, between human and cosmic, between possible and impossible, exist more in our minds than in the fabric of reality itself. These encounters share common threads that weave through the tapestry of human experience across cultures and centuries. The beings described, regardless of their origin or nature, demonstrate a consistent reverence for consciousness and its potential for growth. They appear not as conquerors or judges, but as gardeners tending a vast field of awareness that spans dimensions and worlds. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their ordinariness. None of our witnesses were seeking extraordinary experiences. They were simply living their lives, performing their daily tasks, moving through familiar routines, when reality revealed deeper layers of itself. This suggests that contact with expanded consciousness may be more common than we imagine, filtered through our expectations and beliefs until only the most dramatic cases pierce the veil of conventional awareness. Sleep well, travelers of the twilight hours.